One of the greatest stories of the Old Testament is the story of Esther, a Jewish orphan who lived in the 5th century in Persia. Her story is told in the book of Esther. The historic narrative has several key characters: the bombastic, ill-advised Persian king Xerxes or Ahasuerus, Esther's goodly uncle Mordecai, an evil plotter Haman, a beautiful queen who dared to answer back to the king Vashti. But the book is named after Esther and not the other characters, because in the sovereignty of God, it was Esther who found herself in a position to save others and acted to use her position at great personal risk and ultimately at great advantage for her people. The plot of the story is as it's written. In the late 400s BC in Persia, the world's greatest empire at the time, with territory stretching from the Middle East to India, and with a population estimated to have been close to 50 million people, there lived some Jewish refugees in the empire's capital of Susa. Two of those Jews were the orphan Esther and her uncle Mordecai. The king Xerxes was incredibly powerful, reigning over a vast militarized empire and totally pagan. He had a beautiful queen, Vashti. The king threw his weight around with displays of power, with unrestrained drinking and feasting. At one point, drunk, the king demands Vashti to come and impress his guests. She says one word, no, and as a result of listening to some threatened man, he banishes her from the empire. Then the king creates a kind of world's richest bachelor competition that lasts for a year, whereby a lot of pretty young girls in the empire come to the palace and get beauty treatments and parade for him, and at the end, he chooses one of them to be his new queen. This was beautiful Esther, the Jewish orphan who was chosen, whilst all the time hiding her Jewish heritage. Life goes on in the king's harem. Mordecai, a goodly man, loyal to the king, saves the king from a plot to kill him at one point, although this is forgotten by the preoccupied Xerxes. Meanwhile, the hateful plotting Haman, whose murdered ancestors were responsible for the removal of Mordecai's ancestor Saul as king, has it in for Mordecai and even convinces the king, who needs shamefully little persuading, to declare an edict to exterminate all the Jews in the kingdom. And now we come to the chapter 4. Mordecai calls on Esther to stand up for her people, to beg King Xerxes to change his edict. She explains to Mordecai that such begging, even an approach to the king, may well cost her life. Here is the text that is in the middle of the book that is very important. Esther rises to the challenge before her. She steps out in faith. She succeeds in persuading the king, in saving her own life and that of Mordecai, and in saving all of God's people, and in acting ways that were consistent with her faith in a unique and threatening genocidal historic moment. I want to suggest to you that in the midst of the coronavirus, we found ourselves in another threatening historic moment. It is not threatening genocide like it was for the Jewish people in Esther's Persia, but nevertheless, COVID-19 is life-threatening to some of us, our neighbors, to those in our towns, our nation, and indeed to the whole world. We find ourselves in a moment of high anxiety for the world and the changing cultural moment. We find ourselves in a time of fear, where people fear each other because each one might be carrying this awful invisible virus around on their hands or on their breath. What is such a time as this calling us to do to be as God's people? It is God providentially backgrounded circumstances for all of us, so that we may find ourselves in a position where we, if we act, perhaps at personal risk, may influence the course of events in a way that saves people and brings glory to our God? Can we discern the time, the moment that we are in a spiritual way? Maybe the book of Esther can give us an answer. One of the themes of the book of Esther is the providence of God. God is the true hero of the book, and it is discernible that God lines up circumstances such that Esther is so well placed to act to try to save her people. Ironically, God is never mentioned by name in the book, yet God seems everywhere present behind the events. First of all, for a biblical book, the absence of God must raise a few theological eyebrows. This was clearly such a problem from the earliest history of the book that the Septuagint provided a preface and postscript in the form of a dream of Mordecai and inserted prayers so as it to transform its mixture of good luck and usual coincidences into a textbook example of piety answered by divine providence. Whether God is entirely absent from the book depends on how one considers a number of scribal features. There are phrases where the initial letters of the words, as a form acrostic, actually spell out divine names. For example, in 5:4, the initial letters of the four-word phrase, "May the king and Haman come today, Yavo Hamelech veHaman Hayom," are the letters of Tetragrammaton, God's special name, Yod He Vav He. Once this kind of possibility has been spotted, a similar occurrence, though this time with the divine name spelled backwards, can be found in phrase in 120, Hi vechol hanashim yitnu, or by utilizing the final letters of phrase 513, Ze enu shiva li. You can see it spelled backwards. Those can be added the phrase in 7:5, Hu ze ve'en ze hi, whose final letters, whether forwards or backwards, spelled Ehye, the famous I am or I will be, the divine name expressed by God to Moses at the burning bush. If this seems too far-fetched, it is nevertheless worth noting that the word for king, Hamelech, referring to Persian king, occurs 990 times in 167 verses, and in well-written source, this word will head each new column. To mention kingship so often, without once mentioning the divine king, shows at the very least a remarkable constraint on the part of the author. In the light of the absence of God, it is not surprising that the rabbis and later commentators sought to find a reference to God in Mordecai's words of admonition to Esther when she was reluctant to approach King Ahasuerus on behalf of her people. That relief and rescue will come to the Jews from another place, Makom, place being a rabbinic designation for God. But the rabbis were also prepared to accept that the time of Esther was a period when God was indeed absent. They expressed this through a question addressed to the very name of Esther. Where is there an allusion to Esther in the Torah? We can find it in Deuteronomy 31:18. Va'anochi chaster aster panav. I will surely hide my face. Surely, the humor in book is there. In the drunken behavior of the king and his courtiers, in the absurd solemnity with which the king decrees that every man should wield authority in his own home, in the dramatic reversal when Haman is forced to perform for Mordecai the honors he had thought were due to him. But funny thought these are. They're acted out against the dark background of the threat of genocide against the Jewish people. In Esther, Jewish identity is fraught with danger and must sometimes even be kept secret. Finally, although Esther is part of the Bible, the book famously never mentions God by name. Perhaps paradoxically, this peculiarity has stimulated rich discussions over the centuries concerning the book's theological perspective. the God who keeps silence in this book seems to be the main theological and exegetical issue. The book of Esther is a theodicy in a way that speaks about the God in a situation of existential threats in this world. Among sufferings portrays the mystery of God's secret operation. Also, the characterization of the main actors in the Esther's plots seems to be important for a better understanding of the book and its message. Same as the Jews in diaspora, we have experienced the problems of isolation in period of actual crisis and pandemic. For many, it was the period of fear and distress. So how can Esther help us to live without the fear and distress in these days, and how we can understand Esther today? First, such a time as this requires the people of God to live by faith. We can say, like Esther did, if I perish, I perish. Not fatalistically, not without sadness, not flippantly. No, we say it filled with certainty for our future. We say it with hope, for this is what hope is, certainty of what we cannot see. As real as this invisible coronavirus is, equally as real is God's love for us. We may find that in this threatening moment, our faith becomes stronger, not weaker, our relationship with God closer, our confidence in love greater. That is the hope for all of us who believe. Secondly, such a time as this requires that God's people be prepared to voice our hope, to point people to God, and to invite people into the hope that we have. Third, such a time as this for the people of God calls for us to become known for our love. This is our mission, to live by faith, to share our hope. Four, such a time as this entreats us to be bold as God's people, bold in our own nervous way, just like Esther. One of the reasons to love Esther is because she's so relatable. Such a time as this demands that God's people pray and do the things that Christians do, sing, meet, pray together. Esther calls for a fast. We know that prayer and fasting always go together in Scripture. And last, such a time as this entreats us to remember the unchanging nature of the God's word. One author, Charles Spurgeon, put it in this way: every child of God is where God has placed them for some purpose. And the practical use of this point is to lead you to inquire for what practical purpose has God placed each one of us where we now are. We may wish to be in another position where we could do something for Jesus. Do not wish anything of the kind, but serve him where you are. If you are sitting at the king's gate, there is something for you to do there. And if you were on the queen's throne, there would be something for you to do there. Do not ask to be either gatekeeper or queen, but whichever you are, serve God the Rhine. Are you rich? God has made you a steward. Take care that you're a good steward. Are you poor? God has thrown you into a position where you will be better able to give a word of sympathy to poor saints. Are you doing your allotted work? Do you live in a goodly family? God has a motive for placing you in so happy a position. Are you in an ungoodly house? You are a lamp hang up in a dark place. Mind you shine there. And finally, the narrative of the book of Esther is a rich tapestry of socio-political maneuvers that call for our attention. The Mordecai-Haman narrative offers us insight into how religious conflicts can be underlined by other reasons and explanations, such as politics and social differences. The misuse of religious autonomy can result in complacency, pomposity, and disrespect for others. Traditionally, the story has been read uncritically, and so the social, political, and ethical implications have not been applied for holistic benefit of the people of God. Much of the pains in our world today can be prevented if we can show a little respect to others and be altruistic a bit. It means showing respect for the others because of the common humanity we share, to be just a little bit like Queen Esther.